Hello there. Thank you very much for inviting me to come or stay and talk about the journey to the Mayflower, which it's called the journey to the Mayflower because I'm not particularly interested in the sea voyage of the Pilgrim Fathers or what happened to them in New England. My subject instead is the underground church that they had been part of, the illegal religious movement in the time of Elizabeth I, James I, and why they left England and sailed on the Mayflower to North America. And the background of that story is the story of the English Reformation, when Henry VIII took the English church away from Rome, and then his son Edward oversaw a much more thoroughgoing Protestant Reformation. But he died, and his sister Mary quickly came to the throne and restored Catholicism, and she was determined to eradicate Protestantism. She revived the heresy laws and rounded up those who persisted in their faith, and she had them publicly burned alive. In her time, Protestants formed a broad-based religious underground, and they met for worship in secret, in cellars, in clothworkers' lofts, in woods, in ships, inns, private houses. And the London Underground Church got through a succession of ministers. 3 were arrested, 2 escaped, but 1 was burned alongside members of the congregation. About 300 people, we think, were burned altogether during Mary's 4-year campaign. And I think that it's hard to overstate just how catastrophic Mary's attempt to burn Protestantism was, because the Catholic faith had, until really just a few years previously, been the religion of all English people, going back for countless centuries. But Mary made many people feel now that Catholicism was a Roman foreign invasion, killing the English pastors and bishops. And those who already thought that Catholicism was wrong now saw it as a sadistic killing of their pastors. They came to believe that it was an anti-Christian monster, the sworn enemy of real Christians. And Mary might have succeeded in this campaign if she had enough time, but she died also relatively soon after coming to the throne, and her sister Elizabeth became queen, and she was a Protestant, and the country swung back to Protestantism again. But Queen Elizabeth's Protestant faith, although it was emphatic, was surprisingly mild. Protestantism was a religion of progress. The question on English Protestants' lips was, what will be next? How will our godly queen lead us forward to a more perfect reformation? And Elizabeth's answer was, I don't want to go forward. Actually, I want to go back a bit. She made the Church of England very much like it had been under her brother Edward, but with some crucial differences, all backward looking. Most notably, Edward had instructed ministers in the Church of England to wear a simple tunic, like in other European churches of the Reformed tradition, and not the traditional ornate robes of Catholic tradition. Elizabeth brought those priestly robes back and insisted that every minister in the Church of England wear them. If Elizabeth had become queen straight after Edward, if Mary's reign of fire hadn't happened, I imagine that Elizabeth would have got away with it. Would have been controversial. People would have complained, but she would have stuck to her guns, and people would have got used to her slightly more backward-looking version of Protestantism. But Mary's fires had hardened Protestants' antipathy to Catholicism, and they desperately wanted to get rid of every last remnant and remainder of that saint-torturing regime, as it was in their heads. And they had lived through it. The people who campaigned against these vestments were called Puritans. Puritan ministers wrote books and they preached sermons against the vestments, and they refused to wear them. So, what do you do when some ministers want to wear robes and some don't? Your answer, just to take a wild stab in the dark, might be let everyone do what they want to. but letting everyone do their own thing was not thinkable in the 16th century on either side. Nobody wanted to do that because everybody knew there must be one religion uniting the whole of society. It was entirely obvious that the church was an entire nation, all united in one faith. It had been that way for 1,000 years throughout Western Europe. Everybody knew that if you let every minister decide for themselves what faith to teach and practice, if you let people decide for themselves what religion they were going to follow or not follow, then the Queen would lose all control of the church would lose all of control of society, and civilization would collapse. And you don't want that now, do you? So, in 1566, the Queen said to Archbishop Matthew Parker, sort this out, all this diversity and disobedience. Parker gathered all the London ministers together. London was where most of the troublemakers were. And he dressed the model in the regulation robes, and he got him to walk down the ecclesiastical catwalk. And he said to all the assembled ministers, this is the dress code. Sign here to say that you promise to abide by it. And a third of London ministers refused, and they were suspended. London was in uproar. Huge crowds of women doorstepped the Bishop of London to complain, hooted at him in the street. There were fights in church services. Ministers who wore the robes were attacked. They had stones thrown at them. They had to worship with bodyguards. And you might well think the Puritans were making a big fuss about nothing. And you might be right. We're pretty used to Anglican vicars wearing robes. Who cares what they wear? But a few things to consider. Think about how inescapable these vestments were. They were what congregations looked at throughout the whole time that their minister was preaching or presiding or praying or baptizing through every moment of the service. Protestantism, as I said before, was relentlessly forward-looking. And the robes had been removed from churches once already, and one might tolerate delays in Reformation. But sliding backwards was turning back on God. And above all, again, imagine what it must have been like to live through the saint-burning regime of Queen Mary's time, only to find your own godly ministers who had survived being required to wear the uniform of their killers. It was hard for many people to accept, and so what were the radical Puritans to do, the ones who really could not accept these vestments? They looked at their parish churches and they said, that makeshift church that we had in Queen Mary's time was more like a proper church than these places. So the underground church was revived, and not to hold out against the flames of Rome this time, but against the Church of England. These gatherings moved about from place to place throughout London. Their services were raided and they were arrested. They were questioned by the Bishop of London and they were kept in prison. The Bishop of London, Edmund Grindal, had some sympathy for these dissidents. He didn't like the robes either, but he wore them in deference to his beloved Protestant Queen. And he couldn't understand why the dissidents refused to do that. And he really, really did not want to be persecuting anyone. He thought that Protestants were better than that. He himself had fled the country in Queen Mary's time to escape death at the hands of the Catholic Bishop of London. That was what Catholicism was like in his mind. And yet here he was turning into the persecuting Bishop of London himself, arresting people who were doing their own thing. And the problem was that Grindal, like everyone else, was thoroughly committed to the idea of the church state, where the country was united in one religion. So he had to get the dissidents back in line. He tried talking to them and arguing theology, but they weren't convinced. You can't unite a whole country in one religion using arguments. Grindal tried gentleness, repeatedly releasing the offenders from prison, hoping that they would realise that the Church of England was their friend. But you can't unite a whole country in one religion using gentleness either. He pleaded with them to restore the unity of the church, but you can't unite a whole country in one religion by pleading. If you are committed to uniting the nation in one faith, there comes a point when that is impossible without coercion. If you think that it's unchristian to persecute, but that the true Christian faith is obligatory, something has to give. So the London Underground Church were basically kept in prison till they died, which generally wasn't too long. Elizabethan prisons were outlandishly unhealthy places. And their casualties included their minister, Richard Phipps. So they pointed out that they were in effect being executed for their faith by a regime that wanted to keep its hands clean. And what was the result of this policy of using prison to discourage religious dissenters? Well, it reduced the number of dissenters in London for now. It created martyrs, which made the survivors more committed than ever, unwilling to betray their hallowed memory. But above all, it changed what the underground church was. It changed how they understood what they were doing. When they had started their secret worship meetings, they didn't think that they were quitting the Church of England. They were simply avoiding the vestments being used in their parish building until the next phase of Reformation came. But after a few years of this kind of treatment, they decided that they were separatists from the Church of England, and they denounced it as a false church. If they ever went back, they said they would be abandoning Jesus Christ. The Church of England kept up the pressure, and the underground church sank and shrank and seemed to be dying out. Persecution does sometimes succeed in killing religious movements, but it is a dangerous policy. And in 1581, a second wave of separatism broke out in East Anglia. This time, Robert Brown gathered churches in Norwich, Bury St Edmunds, and once again they were in and out of prison. And under Brown, the separatist movement became, well, for one thing, it became known as Brownism, but it also became more radical than ever. Brown taught two big controversial new ideas. One, the church, he said, is a democracy. The Elizabethan church was a monarchy ruled by the Queen through her hierarchy of Lord Bishops. Before Brown, the most radical Puritans were Presbyterians. They wanted to demolish that hierarchy and give power to the clergy of the church. Brown, however, said that the true church is not ruled by either bishops or pastors. What the people of God decide together as a body has greater authority than what any individual member in any role may decide. He said, the voice of the whole people is the voice of God. That was a principle of government which became foundational not only to Baptist and congregational churches, but to Western states. And his second idea was that religion should be free, and the church should be a voluntary community, not a church state, not a Christian nation. The Lord's people is of the willing sort. That was his catchphrase. Brown said the state has no right to tell the church how they must worship God, and the church has no right to make laws for unbelievers. Those who wish to join the church and abide by its rules should be free to do so. Those who don't want to should be free to go their own way. Neither church nor state should ever use coercion in religion, he said, because only those who come willingly are worth having in the first place. The Lord's kingdom is not by force, he said. Well, the Queen and the Puritans disagreed about the shape of the Church of England, but they still agreed there should be one Church of England imposed on every person in the country. Even the underground church had thought the same until now. They quit the Church of England, but they never challenged the idea that there should be a state church, and they voluntarily formed their own church. But in the unlikely event that they ever got the opportunity, they would have imposed that church of theirs on every English person, whether they wanted it or not. Robert Brown discovered the idea, which is there in the New Testament, of the church being a voluntary community for committed believers and not a coercive church state. And he was hardly unique among English Protestants in disapproving of religious violence, but he was extremely unusual in finding a way to avoid it, because he developed a theology that made violence unnecessary as well as unpleasant. Naturally, any theology that would so radically distribute power was intolerable to the crown, and Brown and his followers were repeatedly punished and imprisoned and banished. And so the separatist church went into exile in Middelburg in the Netherlands, believing that the Lord was leading them like he led the earlier children of Israel out of slavery in Egypt. They lived in poverty and they got ill, but they were able to publish books. Brown wrote groundbreaking books telling people to throw off the religious autocracy of the Queen and to form their own churches. He was outlawed by a royal proclamation, and the two men who distributed his books in Suffolk were hanged. And Brown also rediscovered the disadvantage of inventing democracy when his ideas proved too radical for his own congregation. He said the voice of the people was the voice of God, and the voice of the people said, "You're sacked." In my favourite moment in the whole of the story of the separatist movement, Brown stormed out of the house that they were meeting in and then came back in and said, "Hang on, this is my house, you get out." His remaining followers went with him to Scotland, where they did more prison time, and they finally gave up the cause and they went back home. Brown might have been the ideas man of the separatist movement, but he wasn't its great hero. He signed a submission to the Archbishop of Canterbury and eventually became the rector of Thorpe A Church in Northamptonshire. Unpredictably, to say the least, he also seems to have continued leading illegal churches while publicly writing against the next generation of leaders of the movement, which was still being called Brownism. The next wave of the separatist movement was based in London, reviving the remnant of the original underground church, and that was led by John Greenwood and Henry Barrow. Greenwood was arrested when one of their services was raided, and he was put in the Clink prison. Barrow visited him in prison, and when the jailer realised who he had under his roof, he refused to let him out, and Barrow was kept in prison for the rest of his life. The pair of them wrote an extraordinary series of books, about 3 a year between them, which is not bad considering they weren't supposed to have paper or ink. One of Barrow's books was written in the margins of someone else's book, and their followers smuggled these writings to the Netherlands where they were printed, and then they smuggled the books back, and these books kept Robert Brown's radical ideas alive. Those who weren't in prison worshipped in the summer in fields and woods around London. They had no set liturgy, which they didn't believe in, but they prayed in their own words, and any member of the church could preach. They could be quite loud, charismatic meetings. One witness said, "In their prayer, one speaketh, and the rest do groan, or sob, or sigh, as if they would wring out tears." There was a meeting in the upper room of a pub in Suffolk, which got complaints about the noise from across the street. The bishop's men raided not just separatist meetings, now not just their meetings, but their houses. They seized illegal books, including translations of the Bible. They dragged people out of their beds and arrested them. And some were kept in irons, some were beaten. A consignment of 1,000 copies of one of Barrow's books was seized by the English on the Dutch coast and was handed over to the English chaplain there, Francis Johnson, for him to burn. He was a bit curious, so he burned all but one of the books, and he took it home, read it, was converted, came to London, joined the underground church, and became one of its ministers. The Archbishop of Canterbury got a law passed making separatism a felony, and Barrow and Greenwood were both executed at Tyburn. Another leading separatist, John Penry, who had written the scandalous Martin Marprelate tracts, was written some of them. He was hanged on the Old Kent Road, and the rest of the church, led by Francis Johnson, now were in fear of their lives, and most of them went to Amsterdam. They set up their own printing press there, and they bombarded England with propaganda. Their numbers increased as newcomers came over from England, and although they were individually very poor, they were able to afford their first purpose-built church. Their numbers were swelled hugely after James I became king in 1603 and Richard Bancroft became Archbishop of Canterbury. Bancroft launched the fiercest attack yet on the Puritans, and he required every minister in the Church of England to declare his approval of the prayer book. He declared that every citizen who criticised the book was automatically excommunicated. And so 300 ministers were suspended, and in the end 73 of them were permanently deprived, 5 times as many as in Parker's day. So inevitably new separatist churches sprang up, notably in Gainsborough in Lincolnshire and in Scrooby, Northamptonshire. The Gainsborough group was to provide many of the Pilgrim Fathers a few years later. They faced persecution, they made it over to Amsterdam, and people who had spent their lives working on farms had to start learning urban industrial skills. Teachers became masons. One of their leaders, Henry Ainsworth, who was one of the leading Bible translators of his generation, at one point was living on 9p a week, which is what agricultural labourers could make in a day. And this brings us to the years running up to 1620, the year when one group of these separatists left the Netherlands for the New World. I think I promised you at the beginning that I would try to explain why a group of people left England and sailed on the Mayflower to North America. But if so, it turns out that they're two separate questions, doesn't it? Because I hope it's pretty clear why the separatists left England. Their underground church was illegal, they faced harassment, they faced prison, they faced death in prison, they faced execution. And the Netherlands was a haven from all of that. It's rather less obvious why they would then leave the Netherlands for America. It wasn't, as often seems to be said, to find freedom of worship, because they already had found complete freedom of worship in the Netherlands. Well, the key consideration, according to the separatists themselves, was that life in Dutch cities seemed just too grim for the church to have any future. They write that they had been losing the older generation, who died prematurely after years of unskilled urban labour or had used up their savings, and they returned to England. They were losing the younger generation, on the other hand, who were fed up with godly poverty and gone off into worldly Dutch society. The leaders feared that within years their church would collapse. They imagined that America would allow them to create an English village 3,000 miles from the nearest bishop. Another thing they talked about was the sense of failure in their mission. They had hoped that seeing their church in action would inspire the Dutch to a new Reformation, but the Dutch ignored them. The English paid more attention to them, but too few of them were willing to join them in the Netherlands, and fewer stayed. Admittedly, America would offer still fewer opportunities to convert the English, but perhaps they said they would be God's instrument for converting the Americans. A third concern was war. The Netherlands had been fighting for its independence from Spain, and a truce in the war was due to expire in 1621. That was a serious consideration, although the Netherlands had been at war with Spain when the separatists first came over, and it hadn't worried them unduly. A fourth concern was, paradoxically, to stay English. The younger generation had gradually integrated with Dutch society, and it was clear, the leaders said, how like we were to lose our language and our name of English. So if their church was to survive in the Netherlands, becoming just another Dutch denomination, it would defeat the object of their mission to England. So they had their reasons for going to North America, to be sure, but I find something intriguingly inconsistent and incoherent about the reasons that they gave for their decision to go to North America. So the main explanation was that they were driven there by the grimness and poverty of life in Holland, they said, but they also said, quote, at length we came to raise a competent and comfortable living in Holland, and though it wasn't easy at first, after many difficulties we continued many years in a comfortable condition. So on the one hand, they say that they looked to America as a place of better advantage and less danger than Holland. But also, they say in the same writing, that they were aware of its inconceivable terrors and perils. They said the miseries of the land would be too hard to be borne. It would be likely to consume and utterly to ruinate them. They feared famine, they feared nakedness, sore sickness, and grievous diseases. They had heard terrifying accounts of the indigenous Americans torturing people to death. They were aware of how many settlements had failed. The separatists themselves had tried 3 times already to settle in North America, and many lives had been lost. Add to all this the perils of the journey itself and the frailty of the travellers, and one has to wonder in what sense exactly they were using the phrase less danger when they talked about North America and the reasons for going there. And so some members voiced their serious doubts about the expedition, and their leaders' reply is fascinating. They said, all great and honourable actions are accompanied with great difficulties and must both be enterprised and overcome with answerable courages. So the reason they needed to leave Holland, supposedly, was to escape its hardships, and when critics of the plan worried that America would have great hardships, they were told that this great enterprise was worth great hardships. So what was the enterprise, if not to escape hardships? The colonists seemed to have difficulty articulating exactly what compelled them to leave the Netherlands for America. They had a sense of an important enterprise, and they rationalised it in terms of escaping the difficulties of life in Holland. But it didn't meet that objective terribly well. And I think to fully understand their calculation of the risks and imperatives, we have to remember how ingrained it was for the separatists to see their story in biblical terms, following the pattern of the story of the Exodus, God leading the new children of Israel out of the bloody and anti-Christian land of their birth to a place that he had prepared for them. They had been delivered from England, and there could be no going back. And yet the Netherlands had not felt to them very much like the promised land at all, which meant that instead they were in the wilderness, that stretch of wandering and learning that occupied Israel before reaching the promised land. As I said earlier, Protestantism was a fundamentally forward-looking movement, and the separatists saw themselves as the culmination of a century of progress towards truth and obedience while constantly challenging their own orthodoxies. Their church covenants explicitly committed them to embrace God's future revelations, always ready to take the next step. Individuals had once walked miles to acceptable churches in England, and then they had moved to London, maybe. They had then sailed for Amsterdam, and they had moved again to Leiden or Emden. If their dreams had failed to come true in Holland and no simple way forward presented itself, then their whole religious experience and outlook told them that God would reveal a new path ahead. It was Satan who called them back. It was the Lord who called them on. And if the way forward involved a terrifying leap of faith, then yet still they said, we have comfort in the same. They couldn't stay where they were. They couldn't go back. They had to go somewhere new. And where is newer than the New World? Whatever America might entail for them, it was not retreat. It was not going back to Egypt. And that is why they went. Thank you very much.